Hello, welcome back, Scouted Football fans. It is episode 56 on the Scouted Football podcast. Best to get into things right away. So if you are of a Liverpool leaning, my commiserations about last weekend. But if you're an Evertonian, I assume you're all still riding the same high. Duncan Ferguson appeared to be on at the final whistle at Anfield. It's been an interesting past couple of game weeks in the Premier League. And I, for one, have definitely made some very questionable fantasy football decisions. I can tell you that. But speaking of questionable decisions, we saw Thomas Tuchel subbing on and off Callum Hudson-Odoi against Southampton last weekend before declaring he didn't like his energy and then starting him against Atletico Madrid in the Champions League, which may have been one of those old school Ferguson tactics of trying to get the best out of a player, but I suppose we'll never know. We will be exploring a little bit of Chelsea under Tuchel in this week's episode as we pore over the standout stats from the Premier League season so far. We will be looking to unpack and explain the whys and wherefores of which teams and under-23 players in particular stick out in the numbers. And to do that alongside me, I'm very pleased to say I have the Athletics' Mark Carey with me. Mark is a co-host on the Football Fanalytics podcast, which is another great pod, as well as a data analyst at The Athletic, which sounds all very exciting and mysterious. Mark, a pleasure to have you on. How are things going?
Good, thank you. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be on. Thank you for asking me. It's actually still quite novel to hear that title of data analyst at the Athletic. It doesn't get too old at the moment to hear that.
How long is it that you've had that job actually?
It's not even 2 months yet, so it's still sort of getting my foot in the door, so to speak. But with the current situation, everything and everyone is working from home. So still getting settled, but it's quite strange to not have fully actually met anyone that I currently work with other than through laptops.
Yeah, it is a bit strange. I've been in a similar situation myself, and it's difficult to see. You're trying to measure everybody up, and you're thinking, well, I've only ever seen them sitting down. Is such and such 6'4"? Are they 5'2"? What are we dealing with here? Am I going to be completely off with my estimations when I finally meet these people? That's just one of the things that goes through my mind in the various Zoom meetings that we have sort of every week that I'm sure everybody is absolutely sick of. But you're co-host on the Football Fanalytics podcast, which by the name goes very much into detail on the various analytical concepts and tactics and that sort of thing. The most recent one, which is a great listen, is on Zone 14, which is a really in-depth listen. Actually, I was quite surprised at how concise and how well put across it was. But I suppose that's the wonders of the edit, isn't it?
Well, yeah, quite. That is absolutely the wonder of the edit. If you heard the full track, you'd be a bit shocked. But no, I mean that's the whole point of the our podcast, and it does combine. The idea is that it combines things from a football fan's perspective, but has this sprinkling of analytics in it. And the idea is to be able to present things concisely to whatever audience. If you are someone who really likes things given to you from a really technical perspective, then great. I think there's kind of stuff in there for you there. But if you do want it just kind of really simplified and kind of want to learn something that you might not have known before, then also there's something in there for you as well. And it's me and my very good friend Ryan Bailey who we're just having some fun with it as well, which hopefully that kind of comes across that we are just two mates who just chat football, because that is essentially what we are.
I would like to, first and foremost, I'd like to apologise to Ryan because I realised that I didn't invite him onto the podcast because I thought, well, it would be best just to have the one, and the Athletic is quite a pull, so I rolled the dice and I decided to land on you, Mark. So Ryan, if you're listening, I do apologise for not getting you both on, but I do love the podcast, and I'd recommend anybody else who's into that side of things to definitely check it out, because it's very relatable. It makes light of what would ordinarily be quite difficult concepts. It makes it sort of very engaging and approachable. But just back onto sort of the data analysis side of things. Obviously, your role at The Athletic is to be a data analyst, and in the world of football, that is just becoming bigger and bigger. What is sort of the day to day, and how did you get into sort of data analysis?
Yeah, good question. I mean, with the day to day, I'm given that I am still early in the role, it's still definitely a case of learning. I mean, Tom Warville, who is the chief analytics writer at The Athletic, has been so unbelievably patient and helpful in answering my questions that I mean, there have been many of just getting into kind of the do's and the don'ts, a lot of tools that we use in order to to answer these questions of how we can dig into the data of looking at trends and of players and teams in the Premier League and wider across Europe. In terms of how I got into it, it was quite kind of fortunate, I guess, in many ways, in that I'd done my PhD in psychology up at the University of York, and I was doing a lot of data analysis in that regard as well. I mean, that was the key part of it, was answering questions using data. That's what I was doing as part of my experiments. And I got speaking with a good friend of mine called Mladen Sormaz, who basically said, you know that you can do this sort of analysis and just answer a different question, answer it in terms of football. It's really growing. Like, you should get involved, because me and him both love talking about football, and I did, really. And I started my own blog and kind of got things going from there. And Mladen has gone on to a lot bigger and better things. He's now the head of analytics at Leicester City. So I was definitely under his tutelage for quite a while, and he's really kind of pulled me through in keeping me up to date with all the analysis trends, and he's sort of now set me free, and somehow I've managed to make a living out of it.
Hey, that's all anybody ever asks, really. I was going to say I recognised Mladen's name there, so that's quite interesting. You got that little link, but a PhD in psychology. I mean, that's you're kind of very much punching down on me here with my bog standard 2-1 in journalism, but it's really interesting sort of to hear how you kind of have traversed that, speaking the football language from your expertise in data analysis in another area, but and obviously now being a co-host on a podcast, turns out that you've got the gift of the gab as well. But
not quite sure about
that. Hey, don't worry, you want to hear some of the outtakes on this one, believe me. But the premise of today's pod was to dive into the numbers in the Premier League this season, because we know that there's a large and definitely growing analytics and data community in terms of people who like to watch a game of football with an analytical eye, and like to attribute concepts that maybe 10, 15 years ago weren't as common, or maybe didn't even exist, to explain the reasons behind why things happen on the football pitch. So what we've decided to do, Mark and I, is to break down sort of the stats into goals, assists, defensive actions, and ball carrying, because they're sort of the four main pillars of football in the modern day. You can't get by without scoring goals. You can't score goals without assists, and to stop the goals, you've got to get some defensive actions in there. But I think it's best if we start with the goals side of things. And I'm apologies to Mark, who, for anybody who doesn't know, he's a Liverpool fan, but we are going to start talking about an Evertonian, which is particularly sore after last week's result.
It's still too soon.
But we have Dominic Calvert-Lewin this season, who has scored 13 goals and counting in 21 games. And that was quite a standout statistic, because he is the youngest player with 13 or more goals in the Premier League this season. But he also scored 13 last season, but in 36 games. So, that's 14, 15 games less he's played this season. Where do you think the uptick is from? Because, there's not been a huge deal of churn in terms of transfers for Everton. So it's not like he's playing in a massively improved team from last season. But, is there something in the data, Mark? I'm coming to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the long and short of it is that he's getting into better quality chance areas. So the first thing you can look at there is his expected goals per shot for each of the shots that he has. What is the quality that chance or that shot is going to go in, and that's it. Throughout all of his career, this is the highest XG per shot that he's had. It's 0.22. So on average, he's taking a shot that's of a value of a goal every 5 games. So, I mean, you can see that in the goals that he scored as well, right? Like, he's scoring a lot from the 6-yard box, or what they call, I guess, the second 6-yard box, and just behind there. And almost all of his shots, and certainly his goals, are being taken within the penalty area. So he's getting himself into better positions and kind of optimizing his energy, I guess, on the pitch, and not just running around like a headless chicken. He's being far more shrewd in the shots that he's taking. So that's also shown in the numbers.
I suppose it makes sense. We're using numbers to paint this picture, but if you're getting in goal scoring positions more often and you're getting the ball serviced to you, then naturally, in layman's terms, that you're going to score more goals. Especially if you're as adept at football as Dominic Calvert-Lewin is. I think this season, just doing my digging, I found that 58% of his shots were on target, which is the third highest in the Premier League and the highest percentage of any player with 50 or more shots. So he's getting in these good positions, and as a byproduct of that, he's hitting the target as well, which obviously is going to give you a greater chance of scoring goals. So 1 every 5 shots is ending in a goal for Calvert-Lewin this season, which in layman's terms is not exactly a bad return. And that translates to his non-penalty XG. It's the second highest, I think, just behind Patrick Bamford with 10.2 this season. So that indicates that he is, with 13 goals, there's a slight overperformance there. But I mean, for a player of his standard, you'd be expecting him to perform a little bit better than the average striker, which is essentially what XG models are based on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And in terms of looking at that rate, and I was talking about under 23s as well, that rate per 90 XG per shot is the best of any forward under 23. And looking at it kind of at that stage is also really important to look at. And overall, the side from the under 23s, that rate is best for any forward behind Lacazette and Edinson Cavani as well. So I always think that it's really important. Again, we do that on the podcast, but also through the Athletic, is to kind of give that wider context of, yes, we can throw numbers at people, but it's also important to see kind of where that falls against his peers. And as you say, he's just behind Patrick Bamford for non-penalty XG, and then looking at that again on a per 90 basis. So the number of minutes that a player has played can also come into play as to how well they're doing on certain metrics. So to sort of have a level playing field, it's important to look at it on a per 90 basis. And his expected goals on a per 90 basis is actually better than Patrick Bamford's. His is 0.59. Expected goals per 90, and Bamford's is 0.51, so just a little bit better. So his actual chances that he's getting overall is worthy of better than a goal every other game, which is pretty decent. And so that's better than Bamford. There's only 2 people who are better than him across the whole of the Premier League. I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but do you know who they might be?
Oh, this is interesting. Per 90, because when you put it into per 90, I'm now thinking about those players who perhaps, I think, sheer volume of goals, I think I'd have to go with Mohamed Salah.
Interestingly not, and this is where it's good to look at things kind of per 90, and it's good to make sure that you're looking at people who have played enough minutes. If someone's come on for 20 minutes a couple of times, then their per 90 output is going to be highly skewed. So what we tend to do is filter it for players who have played, typically, if there's enough minutes in the season, 900 minutes or more, so 10 games or more. But I filtered it for 500 minutes plus here. And the player with the best expected goals rate per 90, is actually Mikel Antonio, which is quite an interesting one, that his expected goals rate is 0.65 per 90. So he's up there at the top. And Edinson Cavani is just behind him with 0.61. So don't get me wrong, Dominic Calvert-Lewin is up there, certainly in the top 5 for expected goals per 90. And as I say, he's getting himself into better positions. He has got better players around him. I know that you said that they haven't made too many drastic changes, Everton, but they've gone from towards the end of last season from a 4-4-2 essentially to now a 4-3-3, occasionally a 4-2-3-1, but with James Rodriguez behind him and essentially swapping out Theo Walcott for James Rodriguez, I think it's fair to say that he is a bit of an upgrade.
Yeah, just ever so slightly.
Yeah, and they've got a system that really works now with Charlison on the left as well. So better players around him, more closer to him, a lot more kind of midfield solidity and steel in Alan and Doucouré as well. So I think that's also helping Calvert-Lewin to profit from being able to stay in these high quality areas and not do as much defensive work for the team. So yeah, he's certainly out there. It pains me to say it as a Liverpool fan, but he's certainly up there.
Yeah, I was going to say, based on those numbers, I bet you're glad he didn't start the game last week, and it was sort of carrying a little bit of a knock. But yeah, it's not that it mattered in the long run, sadly. Um,
Sadly.
but the one question I think that we have to ask with Calvert-Lewin is, the absolute plethora of strikers that Gareth Southgate has to choose from this summer ahead of the European Championships. You know, are you putting him on the plane?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think there's any question of that. Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say obviously Harry Kane's a shoe-in, isn't he? I think Calvert-Lewin is a shoe-in as well. I mean, we've spoken about Patrick Bamford. I think that even though he hasn't actually got any international experience, I think there definitely is something to be said about picking players who are on form, and Bamford does so much off the ball as well as on the ball that I think he's definitely in with the shout of getting in the England squad as well. But yeah, Calvert-Lewin's had a taste of international football as well, hasn't he? He's done
Yeah.
pretty well. And I think he's just got all the tools to play internationally. He's so aerially dominant. He's definitely, obviously got an eye for goal, as we've spoken about. So I don't see who would maybe get ahead of him, given that he's been in the previous squads recently.
Yeah, definitely. And it was a good job that we discussed this and recorded this now. It's sort of towards the end of February, because I think next week he turns 24, which for anybody who's not aware is the scouted cutoff. And after that, you're dead to us. That's it. You're old. You're going in the recycling. That's it. You finished. So I'm glad that we've managed to get a little bit of Calvert-Lewin love in before he goes, because he was great at the England unders, with the under 20s when back in 2017. So it's one player that I'm really really pleased that it's kind of worked out for, because doing the hard yards at Everton, sort of when he perhaps wasn't scoring as many, maybe playing in a bit more of a withdrawn striking role, having to play with Theo Walcott rather than James Rodriguez, and maybe not having the influence of Luca Digne on one side. He deserves it. He's earned it.
Yeah.
On to assists. And the player that I've picked out for assists in the numbers is Marcus Rashford, because Rashford has first of all a fantastic human being. He's done fantastic work over the past few months. Marcus Rashford has 6 assists from 2.1 XA, which is expected assists. Mark, I've just briefly, for anyone who's unaware or would like a refresher, what is expected assists, and how can it be used, or what can it tell us?
Nice. Yeah, this is something we've spoken about a lot on the Football Fanalytics podcast as well. But I guess so. Expected assists, a bit like expected goals, digs a little bit deeper in terms of the quality of the shot, and it adds that bit more context. Expected assists is essentially an extension of that, because assists themselves, they can be such a poor indication of someone's creative ability. And you think of a lot of players and you judge them by how many assists they've got, but it's really not a fair reflection of their creativity, because you could have one player who plays a 2-yard pass and then their teammate goes on a mazy run and puts it in the top corner, and you can have another person who goes on the run themselves and puts it on a plate for a player 6-yard box, for a Calvert-Lewin, as we spoke about before, and both get an assist, but the two people who have made that assist has done very different things. So what expected assist does is simply measure the likelihood that the pass that they make will actually lead to an assist for a goal. So it adds that further context. Again, a lot like expected goals, of just how much the quality of that pass is. And again, it's presented between a number of 0, so absolutely no chance of an assist, to 1, which is a certain assist. So it just adds that bit more context of just how well the pass has actually led to the likelihood of a goal.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to draw on an example from Serie A, but when I was sort of diving through the numbers of the top 5 leagues, I found that Rodrigo De Paul at Udinese has got 2 assists this season, and he's got some daft XA figure of something like 7. That's an underperformance of his teammates, really, of about 5 goals. So I'm hoping that De Paul doesn't have a grasp on XA yet, because he'd be going into the training ground every day with a face like a slapped arse. Because if people like Kevin Lasagna aren't putting your chances away, you're gonna have a bit of an issue with them. But with Rashford, 6 assists from 2.1 XA, there is a deficit there, or rather an overperformance of around essentially 4 assists. only Harry Kane has a greater overperformance when it comes to XA in the Premier League this season. But is it the same as sort of expected goals, where you'd expect more creative players to get to overperform their XA figures because they are by definition better players, so they are better than average?
Yeah, I think it obviously is the case with expected goals, where more often than not, all players regress to the mean, as we like to say, over a long period. But I think expected assists is a little bit different for the example that you gave, where you have to then rely on the other player or multiple other players, depending on who you're setting up each time, to finish, and they might all have different finishing abilities. Whereas if it's expected goals, which, as I say, typically you do kind of even out over time, is only you each time taking that shot, so it's the same person. Whereas if this makes sense, that with expected assists, you're passing to different people each time, or you potentially are passing to different teammates each time. So there's likely to be a little bit more kind of noise or variation in that regard. But you're right that Rashford is kind of overperforming against his expected assists, and it's one of those. I'm kind of the same on our Football Fanalytics podcast, and I'm always the one who's a bit of a mood killer, in that Marcus Rashford has got a lot of assists this season, but on a per 90 basis, again, he actually jumps quite significantly down the list. On a per 90 basis, his expected assists are 26th in the league for all players, so just that bit lower. So it just shows just how much he is doing well, in his assists versus expected assists. And someone who is doing really well in terms of a per 90 rate of expected assists is Phil Foden, who, I mean, is just a joy to watch, isn't he? I think obviously he's got quality players around him, but he's definitely getting into quality areas and passing to others in quality areas as well. So Rashford is very good and an even better man, as you mentioned, but when you even it out over a per 90 basis, I'm sorry to say that he might not be as good as you might imagine in this season.
So all I'm hearing there essentially is, because Marcus Rashford doesn't have a tram line in his hair, then we should pretty much discount every good thing he's ever done, basically. So that is Mark Carey's decision there, that Phil Foden is the one you should be focusing on, not Marcus Rashford. But no, I understand where you're coming from. Per 90 is the metric that you should be going off. And Phil Foden, absolutely. For the amount of minutes that he plays, the one thing that has always sort of stood out to me, and amazed is too strong of a word, but the thing that has always been there, was that Phil Foden is coming onto the pitch in the 70th, 75th minute, 65th minute. He's having to get up to the speed of the game, and yet he just does it seamlessly, creates chances seamlessly. It helps that he's playing with so many good players around him, but he still has to find them. And to be able to create those chances regardless is it's an endorsement of how hugely talented he is.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about Foden and how he does definitely get up to speed. And I know that with all Man City players as well, you can't, for a fantasy Premier League perspective, you can't bank on any Man City player playing each time, because they've got a gluttony of quality players that they rotate so well. But that's an interesting point about Foden, because there's another bit of context from an analytics perspective there, that his numbers do look really good, but he is coming on quite often against tired teams who have already been worn down by Man City's quality going forward. And it might slightly inflate his numbers, in the sense that he's obviously coming on to a tiring team and able to run them ragged with his energy and with his quality. So again, over a longer period, it's always important to look at. I mean, Phil Foden's having an amazing season, but still important to look at it over a longer period. But his numbers certainly are stacking up really well.
It's interesting that we've mentioned obviously all these English players, but the next one is English as well, and that's Mason Mount, who this season has 3 assists from 4.5 XA, and I believe there are only 5 players who have more, 4 or 5 players who have a higher XA figure this season, and understandably, that a lot of that comes from set pieces, because he is on free kicks, corners for Chelsea. But just sort of looking that up, it's interesting, because through the entirety of last season, Mount registered 4.6 XA in the Premier League, which there's effectively they're mirroring each other, and we're 2/3 of the season through. So, there's scope to say that he has definitely improved in that regard. But there is the set piece caveat. How much value does a great set piece taker add to a team in terms of, shot creating actions, boosting his own XA, boosting a team's, total XG just by having a really good dead ball specialist.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that being on set pieces definitely helps to boost your numbers in that regard. But it's good that you kind of caveated it straight away as well, and that's something that we look to do in our writing, in the Athletic, and something that we do on the podcast as well, where you do have to kind of separate them out, because Mount is the perfect example of how it just simply inflates it so much. And I mean, looking at his expected assists again per 90, if you look at it with set pieces included, he's the third best looking at all the under 23 players. But you take out set pieces and he goes down to the 17th best. So again, just having that extra context, if you didn't know that he was on set pieces, you might have a misrepresentation of just how creative he is. So yeah, you're right to add in that set piece caveat. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely useful to have players who have great delivery and put it, in really dangerous areas. But I guess looking at that difference between assists and expected assists, in that he's got the opportunity to put it in great areas, but that discrepancy again comes from the fact that you need the players to get on the end of it. And Chelsea have, to be fair, Chelsea are really strong on set pieces this season. I think they're up there with the most goals scored from set pieces and from corners. Certainly, I think there's a few that stand out. Thiago Silva's got one or two. Kurt Zuma's got a few as well. And yeah, that's down to the quality of the balls that played in, but it does rely on them actually finishing it, and potentially sometimes the finishing ability of these aerially dominant players at Chelsea might also make Mount actually look a little bit better as well, because if he's putting quality balls in, and no disrespect to, let's say, Sheffield United, but he's putting those balls in and they're not able to get on the end of it, then his overall numbers actually aren't going to be as good. But hopefully I'm saying things that are quite obvious to people here as well.
No, I think anybody who's watched Chelsea this season, who's watched Mason Mount closely, they'll know that, from open play, as you say, his creative numbers, shall we say, are hugely helped by his set piece ability. And if you wanted to put a quantifier on it, 14 places essentially is what you just said. Taking him from third to down to 14th once you strip away the set pieces in terms of his creativity. It's interesting because he's actually had the most shot creating actions from dead balls this season in the Premier League with 35, and he was sort of ahead by quite a margin, which tells you that his delivery is good, and as you were saying there are ample opportunities for players to get on the end of them, because there clearly are, because shot creating actions are the two offensive actions directly preceding a shot. So a pass or a dribble or the foul that is won immediately before a shot is taken by either that player or a player that they are passed to by. So yeah, it shows that Mount has. It's not to say no, do not put Mason Mount in your fantasy team because he's not good. He's not actually good at creating the chances that we want from open play. No, to the contrary, he's very good at creating chances from dead balls. But that his numbers are perhaps a little bit inflated by that, and I think that's reflected in the fact that he's got a very, very high number of key passes this season, with only Grealish and Bruno Fernandes with more, and notably they have 10 assists and 9 assists respectively. A lot of those coming from open play, whereas Mount, a lot of his key passes are coming from these set pieces, which I suppose is why we should be careful with key pass data or chances created, these terms, because a key pass is just the pass that precedes a shot. Like as you were saying earlier, a player who dribbles 40 yards and then passes it to a player free in the 6-yard box, that's a key pass. But a player who passes just over the halfway line to a player who then goes an amazing dribble and scores or takes a shot, that's also a key pass. So is that essentially in a nutshell why we need to be careful with key pass data?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you've spoken about this on the podcast before from listening to some of your episodes. So yeah, you're absolutely spot on. And we know what the better alternative is, and that's expected assists, which adds that value and that context of the probability that pass that they're making is actually going to lead to a goal. And this is something as well, which is, again, we say on the podcast, and is important to say in all senses of the word, from a football analytics perspective, that the context is key. And I know that we've spoken about it, a lot before, but it's absolutely crucial that we're not driven completely by the numbers. And there's a reason why, we're talking about the footballing context around Mason Mount, and we're not just going purely on his numbers. You need to actually, watch the game and see why that pass was like that, or whether it was actually as good a chance as we might think. And yeah, the context is key, is the absolute phrase that we always go by. You must actually dovetail the data with what you see by eye as well. Never should the two be completely separate, but we think that together they can be really supportive. And key passes is a key example of that, where if you are to look at it and say that someone's got more key passes than another, great. You might think that, okay, the one player is better than another, but that context of what that pass was is where it really comes into its own. And yeah, there are other measures that can help with that, like we said before about expected assists, but there's also watching the match and actually seeing that it was a key pass or it wasn't a key pass, and that adds context as well. So I'll keep saying it, but context is definitely key.
Yeah, well, that's a mantra to live by there with the context. And I mean, the example that was kind of popping into my head when you were saying that was, it would be like saying that just because a player has more shots than another, it makes them a better striker. Whereas, those shots could all have been ballooned over from 40 yards and, very
Absolutely.
much Alessandro Diamanti style. So, there's... There are caveats, and as you say, context is very important. Which is funny you should say. It's almost like we planned this. But the next player, context is very key, and it's a player who you'll be very familiar with, Trent Alexander-Arnold, and I mean I've included him in the assists section of the plan here, but the one that, because of what we've just said on about context, the one thing that really, really irks me, and it shouldn't. I should have more going on in my life that this shouldn't annoy me. But is whenever I see statistics, and I use that with sort of air quotes, that get bandied about on Twitter about Trent Alexander-Arnold lost possession 30 times in this game, and everyone's going, "Oh, that's shocking. That's terrible. He mustn't be that good." And it's like, well, no. Again, context is important here. What kind of passes is he trying? He's in that little space just over the halfway line. What about those crosses and those passes, the crossfield balls that he's trying to bend into the penalty area, which, 1 in 10 may work, but think about it. Who else is capable of doing that in the Premier League? Is that it probably doesn't annoy you as much as it annoys me, but is that something which has sort of been on your radar as well?
No, absolutely, and it does annoy me just as much. I mean, you can call me just as sad as you if you want to as well. But no, it does, and that's where I think that, again, I come back to it with our podcast, but that's where I think that a lot of people who are a little bit more in the know about football analytics and statistics have a kind of a duty of care to help to kind of maybe educate people who might offer that statistic without any context, because they're not doing anything wrong. They're just trying to work out, trying to build a picture out of something that they see in the numbers. But I think we all have a duty of care to help people to add that context and realize that there's more to it and there's a reason why that statistic exists. But yeah, as you say, if you just throw statistics at people and hope that some of it sticks, then I think that's potentially quite a risky game to play, I think. But I mean, you're right with the possession loss one. Absolutely, and we do something. We use this quite a lot in our articles in the Athletic of turnover percentage, of essentially being of the total touches that a player has. How many times do they lose possession? So if they have the ball 100 times and they lose possession half of the time that they have it, then they have a turnover percentage of 50%. So quite a simple kind of metric to work from, but the people who have the highest turnover percentage, as you say, are typically the ones who have the high risk, high reward pass. And you got to be careful of using it, because the people who are highest on this are the likes of Bruno Fernandes and Kevin De Bruyne and Trent Alexander-Arnold, as you say. So, I mean, just because someone's high or bad on something, so to speak, exactly as you say, does that mean that they are then bad players? I think we can safely say that the likes of Bruno Fernandes and Kevin De Bruyne are not bad players. So that in itself shows that there's got to be more to this statistic than just that that this player isn't very good at it. And of course, that context is that they are going for that difficult pass, and the one which, when done well, can lead to a chance on goal. And that's why they are the players they are.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think sometimes it's used by engagement-heavy accounts who are just trying to use it as a stick to beat him with, or a Liverpool player in general, because we know there is that, and I've never quite understood it, but hey, it's one of those things that I'm sure you've had to put up with plenty of times. Obviously, I've put him in the assists column, and I haven't really done any digging really into this, and perhaps the reasons why. I was hoping to leave this to you, being the Liverpool fan. But 25 assists over the last 2 seasons, and just 3 this season. It's actually in line with his XA. With it being around 3.1. What do you attribute the drop off to? Because we've seen plenty said about why Liverpool have had problems this year. But I mean, what's your assessment of the lull? I think, and I think it's a temporary lull in Alexander Arnold's sort of creative output.
Yeah, and I mean, like a lot of players, I think Trent Alexander-Arnold is one of those where you say that he's too good to not come out of this stronger. So I think it is very much a temporary one. And again, if you were to look at it over a longer period, overall he's still doing incredibly well across his whole career so far, which is completely in its infancy as well. He's so young, but yeah, I mean, to be honest, I actually don't have too many numbers in my notes sort of written down on Trent, because maybe it's because I feel so passionately about it as a Liverpool fan that I can just rattle it all off. But I think that, a key thing, I mean, you can't hide away from the whole injuries thing, but I think it's more nuanced than just saying they've had injuries, so they're struggling. But there's definitely, he's getting forward less. I don't know what his actual kind of average position on the pitch is from this season to last season, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that he is a lot deeper. And I think that's because there's a lot of less protection behind him. So he was able to really bomb on and essentially just camp in the final third, where knowing that he would have essentially Jordan Henderson just tucking into that sort of half space on the right hand side of him. Whereas I think he's just thinking twice a little bit as to whether to go or not, and just knowing to stay a little bit closer, because he knows that he hasn't got the likes of Virgil van Dijk and Joe Gomez to protect the defensive line. So definitely, I think the fact that his numbers are down is that he's also not attempting to get forward quite as much. And it's a definite tactic that Virgil van Dijk each time on the left, in the left centre half position, would just play a raking ball to Trent, who would always be and often be high on the right already, and they'd be able to start the attack from there. Whereas this season, I think they're building through the midfield a lot more. There's fewer switches of play from the defence, because it's a different defender each time. But judging by the recent weeks, that he's not able to already pick up high positions and receive it there, and then the space in behind. And yeah, I could go on for hours on this, but I definitely think that it's simply because he's not getting the ball in as many dangerous areas to do that. I don't think the quality of his balls are any different.
I'm satisfied with that. That is the scouted football opinion. That is by proxy now. That is, I'm very, I'm content that Trent will come back, maybe not bigger, but better. I mean, I don't think he's going to grow anymore. He's not that young, but he will come back just as good, if not better, than he was before. And obviously, as you say, it's nuanced because again, with assist data, it relies on other people to help you out in that regard. Moving on to defensive actions, and obviously they are tackles, interceptions, pressures, the like, basically anything that you'd categorize a defender to do primarily. So, I mean, I think sometimes we see with defensive stats, they are the ones which perhaps a duty of care should be used to a greater degree, because defensive metrics are nuanced in the sense that they need to be possession adjusted.
Absolutely.
Would you be able to give us a brief explainer on what possession adjusted metrics are and why they're important, or rather why possession adjusting tackles or interceptions is important?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I can try, but you're right that it absolutely, again, it's probably the one where there is that duty of care the most. You see it a lot on Twitter with X person has made 100 interceptions in the game, and you just think, okay, well, there's a reason why there. And essentially, it's important to possession adjust the metrics, because you can't perform a defensive action if you don't have the ball. And it really is quite as simple as that, and that you need to have the opportunity to defend to actually make that defensive action. So, yeah, one player might make far more interceptions than another, but you need to account for the fact that they've had more opportunity to do so. So, I mean, the example that I always go to, and you won't be happy to hear me say this, is that you compare Newcastle and Manchester City, in that someone who does a lot of defensive actions isn't necessarily the better player. So, yeah, you might, you look at someone like Ruben Diaz, that it's probably actually the absence of his defensive actions that make him such a great player. So if you were to do it based purely on his numbers, you'd maybe say that he wasn't such a great player. But yeah, you compare the fact that Man City completely dominate the ball and they barely give up possession, versus maybe a passive team like Newcastle, where the defenders are going to make a lot more defensive actions, then it's incomparable. So a way that you can combat this, and it's really neatly done by Tom Worville at the Athletic. A little plug there was that he does it in a really neat way, is that he adjusts it by looking at the number of times that a player makes those actions for every 1,000 touches that an opponent makes when they're on the field of play. So a really kind of equal proxy to go from, where all players, to some extent, as best we can, kind of have an equal opportunity to defend, and say when they are out of possession, then how much do they engage in these defensive actions. So that's, I guess, why it's important, and what we can do at least to try and level the playing field a little bit.
Yeah, I think leveling the playing field is probably a good way of putting it finally there, because I think if you're out of possession a lot, then you're going to be doing a lot of defending, and by default you're going to probably register more defensive actions. So that's just a byproduct of being a defender who plays in a passive team like Newcastle, and I don't mind at all you plugging the Athletic in there, because we're all about sort of helping up and coming new sites to really increase their following and their and the like. But yeah, I'm reliably informed actually that Steve Bruce on the Newcastle dressing room wall has the Paolo Maldini quote of I say quote of the if I have to make a tackle, I already know I've made a mistake.
Yes.
But has crossed it out and has decided that that no, the more tackles you make, the more successful you are. Forget goals. But yeah, that's reliable information, absolutely airtight from a Newcastle insider, obviously.
I do absolutely love that quote. We've used that quote before, but no, I absolutely agree. I think that the thing with defending as well, again, with everything in football, but I think even more so with defending, is absolutely placing just that bit more importance on video analysis and live scouting, from a recruitment perspective. Because for everything that we said, if you were to just dig into the numbers, which is a naive thing to do, to just base your perspective solely on numbers, but I think it's even more important for the reasons that we just said, that you need to see that context of how a player is doing, in real life. And yeah, as I said before, that absence of defensive actions is probably what makes them a quality defender. And things like positioning and making sure that they are picking up their man, that all the off-ball stuff is the thing that really makes a good defender. So I think really difficult to look at from a statistical perspective, but I guess let's try and talk a little bit more about it, because I know we've got more to speak about of some players in the Premier League.
The intangibles, the unquantifiables.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And now that we've just had that discussion, I'm just looking at my notes, and quite conveniently, I've put Declan Rice third most successful tackles in the Premier League this season, which, as we've just discussed, that means absolutely nothing. And it speaks to the fact that when I was first started sort of getting into like the analytics, very tentatively, going on who scored in my university lectures and stuff. I was looking at the sort of the defensive action metrics and being like, why are all the bad teams' defenders apparently the best defenders? And obviously that's why possession just makes sense. But anyway, on to Declan Rice, who is playing in a team who are not a bad team at the moment, currently fourth in the Premier League, are they not?
Correct,
West Ham. Yeah, but yeah, in terms of tackling, he's keeping pace with Rodri and Pierre-Emile Højbjerg of Spurs. Again, both not playing for bad teams. But again, in my notes, I've put, are Rice's numbers inflated by West Ham's tendency to sit off, or is he the man we should be calling Spider Legs, not Wan-Bissaka? God, you can tell I wrote this one late.
Yeah, well, it's funny actually. In my notes, off the back of that, I wrote that Wan-Bissaka is the real OG for tackle win rate. So I think I was a bit tired there myself. But yeah, I think it's important to look at it in terms of kind of win rate as well. So I guess Declan Rice having a lot of successful tackles is the reason behind that is, as you mentioned, is the fact that he's got more opportunity to do so. And I think also Declan Rice has played the joint most minutes of any player in the Premier League as well. So he's not only has he got more opportunity within the team because they have less of the ball, but he's also got more opportunity. And that the success rate is simply because he's played more than anyone else. So that's another factor, as we said. Then quantifying it more per 90 minutes is always key as well. But his win rate is still pretty decent. I think it's still in the top 15% for a midfielder. So, he's still definitely up there. I wouldn't say he is the best, but he is certainly up there. And yeah, I think the fact that West Ham do sit off as well is an important one. And coming on to another defensive metric here of PPDA, for those who don't know, that's passes per defensive action. So it's a proxy of a team's pressing intensity. And West Ham are certainly a passive team in their approach. They have one of the lowest pressing intensities in the Premier League. I think they're 17th for the PPDA metric. So, yeah, he's certainly got more opportunity to do so. So the numbers might inflate it a little bit there, but yeah, for all the reasons that we said, you can adjust that for a number of reasons. But yeah, West Ham are an interesting one, aren't they? Because they're doing so well. The gap between normally it's the ones who are quite passive who are further down the league. And again, sorry, Newcastle are a passive team and further down the league, but West Ham are just defying that at the moment because they are quite passive in their approach, but they've clearly got a way of working in the Champions League spot at the moment.
It's the Czech brotherhood of Kufal and Thomas Souček that is really working. I loved seeing that when Kufal was down with what looked like a head injury the other day. Souček just bounds over and to check he's okay. He's like, no, he doesn't need a doctor. He needs me. I'm here to look after him. But it's interesting that you mentioned passive teams in Newcastle because it's funny because with PPDA, that shows up Newcastle every year in terms of how passive the press is, at least the last 2 seasons anyway. And the thing that I found quite funny a few weeks ago was, well, not funny in a dark way, was that Newcastle had either the lowest or one of the lowest 3 PPDA in the Premier League, and yet had conceded the most counter-attacking goals, which seems a bit counterintuitive, but hey, there's nothing that makes sense about that team. So, it defies, to coin probably a Peter Drury phrase, it defies description.
Yeah, they are a bit of a head spinner. I mean, I haven't done a piece on The Athletic with the Newcastle reporter Chris Waugh, and I don't know whether I should probably steer clear of doing so because from an analytics perspective, they are just a tricky one to work out. So yeah, I might be steering clear of anything from an analytics perspective.
Moving on to ball carrying, which is the final sort of metric that the final area that we're going to discuss in terms of the numbers this season, and we're going to Wolves because everybody knows Wolves have got great dribblers, and that's because Adama Traore is there with his baby oiled arms and what else. But it's not Adama that we're going to discuss. It's actually his Portuguese teammate Pedro Neto, which, saying Portuguese teammate doesn't really narrow it down all that much. But only Adama has made more attempted and completed more successful dribbles than Pedro Neto in the Premier League this season, which is a surprise actually, because while I've seen a bit of Wolves and while I've seen a bit of Pedro Neto and been quite impressed with him, I wouldn't have put him that high.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting one. I mean, it's important as well, I think, to kind of distinguish carries and dribbles.
Yeah.
And it's always one which kind of gets me a little bit in that. So dribbles is when a player with the possession takes it past an opponent, but carries can be running with the ball unopposed. So I guess in terms of like looking to beat their man, you'd look more towards dribbles and looking for someone who just simply likes to carry it forward. Obviously, you look at carries. I mean, with Neto as well, I feel bad for Neto sometimes because he has such technical quality. I think he's such a brilliant player, and again, for his age, he's really gifted. And sorry, Wolves fans, I do think he'll be moving on to a better team in the near future. But I feel for him a little bit in the sense that obviously Jimenez's injury this season, which we all wish him well to make sure that he's back safely soon, but he needs that kind of focal point. Again, talking about someone's assists and expected assists, is that he creates a lot and he's really dangerous, but then he just doesn't, in recent weeks and months, just doesn't have that focal point for someone to get on the end of it quite as much, and it kind of makes him look a little bit worse. I remember watching a game against United where he took on some players and he got to the byline really well. And he was about to cross it and he just realised there was no one there, so he had to turn back, come back, and he kept possession. But where the opportunity was to maybe get a ball into the box, he couldn't quite do it. So I do feel bad for him that maybe his quality, even though we're talking about him in glowing terms now, isn't maybe highlighted as much as it maybe should be. I think with Adama Traore, I think he's baby oiled up. He's fast. He runs like a steam train. But as I think is well documented, his end product is just not good enough. I think. I mean, he's got obviously no goals, no assists this season. He flirted with the idea of improving on his end product. I can't remember when it was now, but it was at the end of last season, I think maybe.
I think it was last season, yeah.
Yeah, he started to actually do fairly well, and I'd have to look a bit more into the numbers on him, but he started to have a bit of end product, and that's kind of dropped off again. And I think he kind of lacks purpose in his dribbling and in his carries compared to Neto, who I think is always kind of looking up and seeing who's around him a little bit more, whereas I think Traore is a bit more head down and just draw players towards him, which can be interesting, can be beneficial in that he's committing 2, maybe 3 players towards him and it's opening up space for other people. But if he's not then passing to those people in space, then unfortunately Wolves don't actually then get on a good attack.
The thing with Adama Traore for me is that it's almost like he's a character on FIFA and the buttons have all just jammed. So you go to sprint and the right trigger has jammed, and he's just sprinting full pelt, and whereas Pedro Neto would maybe be a bit more less full throttle with the trigger, shall we say. But it's interesting that you say that maybe Adama Traore, for how good he is at dribbling and beating players, maybe isn't as effective or efficient with that end product, and I think that's reflected in shot creating actions. Again, coming back to that, so Adama Traore and Pedro Neto are both on par for shot creating actions preceded by a dribble, and they're both on 12, which means that even though Traore is dribbling and beating players more, that he's not turning that into shots for his teammates. Essentially, he's not creating these opportunities for his teammates. And while they're both sort of streets ahead of the rest of the Premier League in terms of carries, dribbles, both metrics, only Harry Kane, which is actually quite surprising, has more shot creating actions preceded by a dribble in the Premier League this season, and he's only 1 ahead on 13. So for Wolves to have two of those players, it makes you wonder, like, if Jimenez was in this team, how much better would Wolves be doing from a purely, being a Traore and Neto providing these chances off the back of dribbles standpoint?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point. I am quite surprised about that Harry Kane one as well. That's good. I'm going to have to go back into the numbers after this episode just to look into that a little bit more. But I think that is a really good point in terms of it. These sorts of metrics actually require a shot to be taken in order for it to kind of be logged. And there's more advanced metrics out there, which I think are really interesting, and probably for another episode that actually look to quantify that in terms of from when a player starts their possession to ends their possession for whatever reason, how much value do they add to the team towards their team scoring a goal, or certainly taking a shot, but the shot doesn't actually have to be taken. So I think that's where it's, certain examples called like non-shot XG, and there's certain things like possession value and expected threat, which I'm sure yourself and a lot of the listeners will be aware of. But there's some really interesting, more advanced metrics which allow you to look at that. And I think Traore would be quite high up in that regard as well, because maybe doesn't have that end product quite as much, but he does certainly advance the ball, sometimes sideways, sometimes out the stadium, but quite often, towards the goal. He actually does add value in getting it into higher quality areas and progressing that ball forward. So, there are loads of other metrics that can maybe add a bit more context, as we've spoken about before, to that. But yeah, the shot creating actions one definitely obviously requires a shot to be taken to show them in that light.
I mean, I've absolutely no doubts that Adama Traore has a very high expected threat value, because he's absolutely terrifying when he's running at you. Especially when you're a team nearer the bottom. It does make you think, like, just let this game finish, please. I'll take a 1-0 now. Just take me to Palace or something. Like, I don't know, a team where, well, actually, definitely not Palace, because they've got Zaha and Ebereeze. So, what am I saying? But yeah, it's one where, again, context needs to be applied, because, of course, if the shot doesn't come at the end, you can maybe feel a bit aggrieved, like Rodrigo de Paul, for example. Yes. That's all, folks. That's all we have time for. A nice round hour, I think we'll finish at. I hope we haven't scrambled your brains too much with all those numbers, and provided a bit of context there. And do remember that context is king. But it's certainly been an insightful one for me, definitely. And I'm sure Mark will agree, especially in his line of work. But there's not too many great feelings than stumbling across a statistic on a player or a team that confirms your assumption or assessment with the eye. And as I say that there aren't too many great feelings, maybe that's a reflection of how I need to get out more. But thank you to Mark for giving up his time. Where can people find you on Twitter, and also listen to the Football Fanalytics pod?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, they can find me on Twitter. I'm Mark Carey 93, and the podcast is on my bio as well. But you can always find us on @Fanalyticspod. And yeah, we do encourage people to listen to it. And it's, if they like anything like this episode, then there's plenty more where that came from on our podcast. But if it's not for you, then feel free to follow me and follow the podcast either way.
Excellent. Well, stay tuned for more from the Scouted Football Podcast wherever you get your pods, or alternatively on YouTube. Make sure to get yourself over there and subscribe for more Scouted content, as well as, if you would like this sort of analysis in written form, in print form, then please do consider buying a Scouted Football Handbook. We have just released Volume 9, which is a fantastic illustration of Gianluca Scamacca on the front. That's all from me. I've been Joe Donoghue, and you've been listening to the Scouted Football Podcast. Bye for now.